It was a busy afternoon at the airport. People were rushing through the terminals trying to catch their flights. Families were saying goodbye, and the constant hum of announcements echoed through the space. Despite all the noise, Ava stood out. She wasn't just any traveler. She was the CEO of one of the most successful airlines in the world. But today she wasn't in a boardroom. She was just another passenger making her way through security. Ava was used to airports and she had seen it all. Long lines, rushed security checks, and sometimes even rude staff members. But she always tried to keep her cool. She had learned early on in her career that when you're in a position of power, you're often expected to remain calm in situations where others might lose their patience. It was a skill that had served her well in the years since she took on the role of CEO. She had faced challenges in the corporate world, dealt with difficult clients, and handled countless problems, all without letting her emotions get the better of her. But today, she was about to face something she hadn't anticipated. Ava walked towards the security checkpoint, her business attire looking polished as always, her demeanor confident but not showy. She didn't like to make a scene. Her every move was a balance of professionalism and humility. She had been traveling for years, and her routine at the airport had become second nature. But as she approached the line, something felt off. The security staff, usually preoccupied with the rush of passengers, seemed to be paying extra attention to her. She didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was because of her neat attire or the small suitcase she was carrying, which suggested she was on a business trip, but then the security guard at the front of the line, a man in his mid-40s, glanced up at her. His gaze wasn't casual. It was sharp, almost dismissive. He gestured for her to step aside. "Please head to secondary screening," he said in a gruff tone. Ava paused for a moment. "I haven't set off any alarms," she said, trying to keep her voice polite. "Is there a particular reason for the extra check?" The guard didn't seem interested in answering. His eyes quickly flicked over her, taking in her neat hair and the professional air about her. Without saying another word, he motioned for her to move along. Ava, surprised, took a few steps forward but decided to push back a little. She didn't like the way he was treating her, and she wasn't the type of person to just accept things quietly when they didn't seem right. "Is this a random check?" she asked again, her voice a bit firmer this time. "I fly all the time. I've never been pulled aside like this." The guard raised an eyebrow but didn't offer an explanation. "Just move along," he muttered. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Ava felt her patience begin to wear thin. She had faced discrimination before, especially as a black woman in a high-powered role. But she had never experienced such an abrupt and rude response to what should have been a simple check-in process. It was the kind of behavior that made her frustrated but also oddly tired. Tired of always having to defend herself or prove her worth. Tired of dealing with the kind of bias that existed in everyday life. As she walked to the secondary screening area, she couldn't help but feel a little irritated. It wasn't just the inconvenience of being singled out. It was the way she had been treated. She didn't like the way the guard had assumed she was a problem, as if her presence there was somehow out of place. In her mind, there was only one explanation for his attitude. He had decided, based on nothing more than her appearance, that she didn't belong. Once at the screening area, she was asked to empty her pockets and step through the scanner. Ava complied without protest, but the whole experience had left a bad taste in her mouth. She was used to people underestimating her, but it was always a little jarring when it happened in public, when she was just another person traveling like everyone else. The security staff seemed busy, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her more closely than anyone else. She couldn't help but think that maybe the guard had assumed she was trying to get special treatment because of her status. But she wasn't the type of person to ask for special treatment. She worked hard for everything she had, and being a CEO didn't make her any more deserving of respect than anyone else. It was the principle of the matter that bothered her, the assumption that she was somehow less than or a problem because of the color of her skin, or her gender, or her position in life. After she passed through the scanner, the guard at the secondary checkpoint didn't even look at her. He barely acknowledged her as she gathered her belongings and prepared to continue through the terminal. She felt a mix of anger and disappointment, but she didn't want to let the incident ruin her day. She was heading to an important business meeting, and she couldn't afford to let something so petty distract her. But as she reached for her phone to check her flight details, She heard a familiar voice from behind her. "Ava, is everything okay?" She turned around to find an airport official approaching her, someone she recognized. He was a senior manager, someone who had worked with her airline on multiple occasions. He knew her face well. His name wasn't something she had to think about. He was part of her professional world, someone who would have known immediately that she wasn't just any traveler. "Everything's fine," Ava said, her voice still calm, but with an edge of annoyance. "But I just went through security and I was treated differently. I'm not sure why, but I've never been singled out like that before." The manager looked concerned. He glanced at the security checkpoint and then back at Ava. He could see the frustration in her eyes, and he knew she wasn't the type of person to make a fuss without reason. His face softened. "I'm really sorry to hear that," he said. "Let me see what happened. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Ava appreciated the gesture, but deep down she knew it wasn't enough. This wasn't just about one bad interaction. It was about the ongoing issues people like her faced all the time. She had worked hard to break through barriers and prove herself in a field that was still dominated by men, especially men who didn't look like her. She wasn't naive enough to think that she could change everything in an instant, but moments like these were constant reminders of how far society still had to go. "I appreciate that," Ava replied, her voice softening a little. "But this is about more than just me. This is about the way people are treated because of the way they look. It's exhausting." The airport manager nodded in understanding. He was clearly trying to take the situation seriously. "We're working on making improvements in training and awareness for our staff. This shouldn't have happened, and I'll make sure it gets addressed." Ava smiled, though it was a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. She wasn't sure if anything would actually change, but she had learned over the years that sometimes all you could do was speak up and hope for the best. She didn't need anyone to treat her like she was special. She just wanted respect like anyone else. With that, she turned to continue her journey through the airport. The incident, though minor in the grand scheme of things, stayed with her as she moved toward her gate. It was a reminder that even when you've made it to the top, there are always people who will look at you and see something else, someone who isn't quite as capable, someone who doesn't belong. It was a problem she had spent most of her career fighting against, and it was far from over. Ava wasn't sure what would come of the situation. Maybe it would just fade into another forgettable moment in a long career. But for her, it was a reminder that she still had work to do, not just for herself, but for others who faced the same struggles every day. As she walked toward her gate, she made a quiet promise to herself that she wouldn't let this moment go unnoticed, and that she would do whatever she could to make sure it didn't happen again. As Ava made her way to the gate, she tried to shake off the uncomfortable experience at security. It wasn't the first time something like that had happened, but it still bothered her every time. She thought about the way the guard had treated her, how quick he was to assume she didn't belong or wasn't important enough to warrant simple respect. It wasn't the kind of thing you could just forget. People didn't realize how these small everyday moments built up over time, especially for someone like her. She was used to being underestimated, but that didn't mean it didn't sting. Over the years, she'd learned how to handle these kinds of situations, but it didn't make them any easier to deal with. As the CEO of one of the largest airlines, she faced challenges every day. Big challenges that required her to make tough decisions, negotiate multi-million-dollar deals, and sometimes even navigate public crises. But it wasn't the big challenges that wore her down. It was the small everyday moments like this one, where she felt like she was being treated differently just because of who she was. When she got to her gate, she found a quiet spot by the window and sat down, pulling out her laptop. Her flight was delayed, so she figured she might as well get some work done. But her mind kept drifting back to what had just happened at security. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been treated unfairly, that the guard had made an assumption about her based on nothing but the way she looked. It wasn't just frustrating. It was exhausting. She'd worked hard to get where she was, and yet here she was, facing yet another reminder that people saw her as something less than what she really was. She thought about how often she had to prove herself, not just in her career but in everyday situations. She was used to working harder, being smarter, and being more prepared than everyone else just to be taken seriously. But no matter how much she achieved, there were always people who seemed to think she didn't belong, who thought they knew better than her simply because of the color of her skin. or the fact that she was a woman in a position of power, and it wasn't just strangers sometimes. Even her colleagues would look at her with doubt, questioning her decisions, second-guessing her ideas, and always wondering if she really deserved to be there. It was a harsh reality, one that she knew all too well, but Ava had learned to cope with it. She had to. She didn't have the luxury of letting her frustrations show, or of giving up when things got tough. In her line of work, the stakes were high. One wrong move could affect thousands of people. She had worked tirelessly to earn her position, and no amount of bias or prejudice was going to take that away from her. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized just how much this kind of treatment still affected her, how much it had always affected her. She tried to focus on the work in front of her, opening her laptop and sorting through emails. But as the minutes passed, the quiet hum of the airport seemed to grow louder, and the pressure on her chest built up. The constant noise, the crowds of people, the interruptions, it all added to the weight of what she had just experienced. She couldn't concentrate. It was as if the incident at security had seeped into her mind, and now it was taking up space she needed for something else. Something important. Ava took a deep breath, staring out the window. She could see the planes taking off and landing, the runway stretching out in the distance. She'd always loved flying. To her, it wasn't just about the destination. It was about the journey. She'd spent her whole life working towards something bigger, something that could change the world. But moments like the one she'd just had at security made her wonder, how much longer would she have to prove herself? How many more times would she be treated like she didn't belong, like she hadn't earned her place? The truth was, Ava had been fighting this battle for a long time. Ever since she first stepped into the business world, she had faced challenges that most people couldn't even imagine. As a young woman of color in a high-powered industry, she had been met with skepticism, doubt, and worse. People questioned her ability to lead, questioned whether she could handle the pressure, questioned whether she deserved the position she had worked so hard for. She had faced countless obstacles, but she had always pushed through. She had to. There was no other choice, but that didn't mean it didn't get tiring. Sometimes it felt like the world was telling her that no matter how much she achieved, it would never be enough to prove she belonged. It wasn't just about breaking barriers in her career. It was about constantly fighting to be seen as equal, to be respected, to be heard. The more she thought about it, the more it wore on her. The airport incident wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much bigger problem that she had seen time and time again. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from one of her colleagues reminding her of the meeting she was about to attend. Ava quickly typed a reply, confirming the time and location. She didn't have time to dwell on what had just happened. There was work to be done. Still, as she looked at her phone, her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. She had an option. She could let it go, move forward with her day and pretend like nothing had happened. Or she could do something about it. Ava wasn't the type to back down. She had built her career on standing up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable. But at the same time, she didn't want to make a scene. She wasn't sure if raising a complaint would do anything to change the situation. After all, this wasn't the first time she'd been treated this way. And who knew if anyone would even take her seriously? But then again, how many other people had experienced the same thing? How many others had been singled out and made to feel less than, simply because of the way they looked or the assumptions others made about them? It wasn't just her problem. It was a problem that countless people faced every single day. And if she stayed silent, what would that say about her? Wouldn't she be part of the problem if she let this kind of behavior slide? Ava knew the answer. She couldn't let it slide. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever felt like they didn't matter, like they were invisible, like they didn't belong. She had worked hard to get to where she was, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. But more than that, she wasn't going to let this guard's behavior go unchecked, because if she didn't speak up, who would? She stood up from her seat and walked toward the airport customer service desk, her steps firm and purposeful. Her mind was made up. She wasn't going to let one more person be treated this way without speaking out. As she approached the desk, she noticed a few people looking at her, but she didn't care. She didn't have time to worry about what anyone thought. The attendant behind the desk greeted her with a friendly smile, but Ava didn't return the smile immediately. She was still focused on the issue at hand. "I'd like to speak with a manager," she said, her voice steady but calm. The attendant seemed surprised but quickly nodded and called over a supervisor. A few minutes later, the supervisor arrived, his face polite but concerned. "How can I help you today?" he asked. Ava took a deep breath and began explaining the situation. She didn't raise her voice, but her words were clear and direct. She told the supervisor about the incident at security, how the guard had singled her out without any explanation, how she had been treated differently just because of her appearance, and how it made her feel. The supervisor listened carefully, nodding along. When she finished, he apologized immediately, though Ava could tell that he was genuinely unaware of what had happened. "I'm really sorry for the way you were treated," he said. "We take these kinds of things seriously, and I assure you, we'll be addressing the situation. We'll also look into training for our staff to make sure something like this doesn't happen again." Ava didn't feel completely satisfied, but she appreciated the apology. She had done what she needed to do. She wasn't expecting miracles, but she hoped that her taking a stand would make a difference, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly simply because of how they looked. She nodded and thanked the supervisor before walking away. Her flight was still delayed, but she felt a little lighter. Sometimes the hardest thing to do was speak up. But now Ava knew that she had done the right thing. She had turned a frustrating moment into an opportunity for change. And that in itself was a small victory. As she sat back down at her gate, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She wasn't going to let anyone define her, not now, not ever. She had earned her place. And if anyone was going to take that away from her, they were going to have to fight harder than that. After the interaction with the supervisor, Ava sat back down at the gate, her thoughts still swirling around the incident at security. The rest of the travelers around her seemed unaffected by the noise, the delays, and the constant stream of announcements. People were chatting with each other, scrolling on their phones, and sipping coffee as though nothing ever went wrong in the world. Ava envied that quiet sense of ease, the kind of calm that came from not having to fight for respect or deal with the small, hurtful moments of judgment that people like her had to face on a regular basis. She looked out the window again, her eyes tracing the outlines of the airplanes as they taxied down the runway, ready to lift off into the sky. Ava loved flying. It always made her feel like she was in control, like she could escape the endless cycle of challenges and criticism that came with her role. But even in the air, she knew that her journey, whether through the skies or through her career, wasn't always going to be smooth. There were always turbulence, obstacles, and moments of doubt. And sometimes the hardest part wasn't even the big problems, it was the small, sneaky ones that made you question if you really belonged. Ava shook her head, trying to refocus. She didn't have time to dwell on these thoughts. She had a meeting to attend, and she was the CEO for a reason. But the more she tried to push the incident from her mind, the more it kept creeping back in. It wasn't just about the rude security guard anymore. It was about the way people assumed things about her before they even gave her a chance. How many times had this happened before? How many times had she been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated? As she sat there, the thoughts started to pile up. She couldn't help but replay the moment at security, the way the guard had looked at her, the way he assumed she was some sort of troublemaker based on nothing but her appearance. It wasn't the first time. She had faced similar situations countless times in her career, in meetings, on calls, and even in the workplace itself. The subtle glances, the comments disguised as jokes, the underestimation, it all piled up. Ava had learned to navigate these moments, to not let them define her or stop her from achieving her goals. But deep down, there was a part of her that wanted to scream, to make people understand how exhausting it was, how tiring it was to always feel like she had to prove her worth, no matter what she achieved or how successful she became. She thought about the road that had brought her here, the countless hours she had spent learning, growing, and fighting for a seat at the table. People didn't understand how much effort it took to get to the level she was at. It wasn't just about being good at her job. It was about pushing through every obstacle that came her way, from challenges in her personal life to the systemic barriers in her professional world. Every success she had achieved felt like it had been earned twice over, compared to her colleagues. It was the price of being a woman of color in a leadership position, and she had accepted that long ago. But it didn't make it any easier to deal with the smaller challenges, the ones that seemed insignificant on the surface but, over time, chipped away at your sense of peace, like the situation at the security checkpoint. The guard hadn't physically harmed her. hadn't used any outright offensive language. But it was the feeling of being dismissed, of being treated like she didn't matter, that stung the most. It was the weight of the assumption that someone like her couldn't possibly be important enough to be treated with respect. Ava felt that familiar sense of frustration start to rise up again, but she quickly checked herself. She wasn't going to let that frustration control her. That was the whole point, wasn't it? To not let these moments define her or her mood. She was better than that. But as the minutes passed, her mind kept turning back to the idea of respect or the lack of it, and how much it seemed to be an issue in her day-to-day life. She pulled out her phone and opened her emails, hoping to distract herself. The flight delay had given her some extra time, and she had a few things to follow up on. As she scrolled through the emails, she started to zone in on the task at hand. It wasn't the kind of distraction that made her forget the incident, but it did help her refocus on something productive. She typed a few quick replies to some colleagues and glanced at her calendar for the day ahead. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced down. It was a message from a member of her team, a brief update about an ongoing project. The update seemed minor, but it served as a reminder of the responsibility she carried. The weight of her role as CEO wasn't always visible to others, but it was always present. She was responsible for making decisions that affected thousands of people: employees, clients, passengers, and shareholders. And on top of that, she was always trying to balance the pressure of being in the public eye, always aware that her actions and decisions were scrutinized far more closely than those of others in similar positions. She thought about how, sometimes the hardest part of being a leader wasn't making the big calls or overseeing projects. It was dealing with the small things, the moments when people didn't take you seriously or when they treated you like you didn't belong, even though you'd worked for every inch of your success. Those small moments were often the most draining, because they made her question whether she was truly respected or just tolerated. The airport was beginning to feel more crowded as the minutes ticked by. A few passengers had gathered near the gate, talking and laughing with each other, while others were frantically checking the status of their flights on their phones. Ava glanced at the overhead screens and saw that her flight was still delayed by nearly an hour. She sighed, wishing she could just get through the day without any more interruptions. She had already been delayed enough in her mind by the whole security incident. Still, she knew she had to keep her head in the game. No one was going to wait for her to feel comfortable. No one was going to stop the world for her. She was the one who had to adapt, who had to keep going no matter how tiring it was. She had to show up, even on the days when she didn't feel like it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the announcement that boarding would begin soon. Ava stood up, feeling the weight of the day press on her shoulders once again. The situation at security was still fresh in her mind, but she knew that for now she had to move on. She gathered her things, her laptop, her briefcase, and her coat, and made her way to the boarding line. As she stood in line with the other passengers, she overheard snippets of conversations. People were talking about everything from the weather to upcoming vacations, but one conversation in particular caught her attention. Two people were discussing an article they'd read online about bias in the workplace. It was a topic Ava was all too familiar with, but hearing others talk about it made her feel less alone. There was a sense of solidarity in hearing people acknowledge the issue, even in passing. For a moment, Ava felt as though there might be hope for change, that maybe things were slowly starting to shift. Even if it was just a little bit. When it was finally her turn to board, she handed her ticket to the agent, who smiled and wished her a pleasant flight. Ava nodded politely but couldn't help feeling a little shaken by the events of the day. Still, she smiled back and stepped onto the plane. As she settled into her seat and looked out the window once more, she realized that she was in fact not alone in this struggle. The road to equality and respect was long, but Ava was committed to it. No matter how many obstacles were thrown her way, the flight attendants began their routine, and Ava closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to relax. It wasn't much, but it was a step toward regaining some peace. The skies were clear outside, and as the plane lifted off the ground, she knew that no matter what had happened on the ground, she would keep rising. She was a fighter, and no one, not even a rude security guard or an unfair situation, could take that away from her. As the plane cruised smoothly through the sky, Ava allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The constant hum of the engines, the soft light from the overhead cabin, and the quiet chatter of the passengers around her made it easy to forget the stressful events of the day, at least for a little while. It was a strange feeling, really. Being in the air with the entire world beneath her made her feel like she was in control, like the weight of the world wasn't constantly bearing down on her. But deep down, Ava knew that wasn't entirely true. The challenges she faced every day, both personal and professional, were never far away, no matter how much she tried to escape them. It was as if she was always carrying an invisible weight, one that came with the territory of being a black woman in a high-powered position. People didn't always see that weight, but it was there. The subtle doubts, the microaggressions, the assumption that she couldn't possibly be as capable as her peers. Those were the things that never really left her. They stayed with her, shaping the way she moved through the world, the way she interacted with others, and the way she saw herself. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing her thoughts to drift. It wasn't easy to admit, but Ava often wondered if things would ever truly change, if there would ever come a day when she didn't feel the need to constantly prove herself, when people didn't look at her as if she didn't belong in the spaces she had worked so hard to occupy. It wasn't just about the big things like boardroom meetings or major decisions. It was the small things, the everyday encounters with people who assumed that her success was an accident, that she wasn't deserving of her position. But in the midst of all these doubts, Ava reminded herself of why she kept going, why she fought through every challenge and every setback. She thought about the people she worked for, the passengers she served, and the employees who relied on her leadership. Every decision she made had a ripple effect. The airline was more than just a company. It was a lifeline for thousands of people. She couldn't afford to let the biases of a few individuals stop her from doing the work that mattered, the work that had the potential to change lives. She leaned back in her seat and let the calmness of the flight settle over her. Her fingers lightly tapped the armrest as she thought about the long road ahead. She still had a lot of work to do, but there was a sense of determination in her now. The earlier frustration she had felt about the incident at the airport had not disappeared, but it had softened. She had spoken up. She had done something about it, and now it was time to move forward. As the flight continued, Ava thought back to her career, how far she had come from when she first started out. She had grown up in a world that constantly told her she wasn't enough. People told her that she'd never make it in the corporate world, that she wasn't tough enough, that her background didn't give her the right connections. But she had pushed through all of that. She had made her own path, built her own network, and proven to herself and to the world that she was more than capable. But sometimes, even with all her achievements, the road was still rocky. And those small, seemingly insignificant moments, like the one at the airport, reminded her of the reality she lived in. The world wasn't always fair. It wasn't always kind, and sometimes, even when you had worked your hardest, people still didn't see you for who you truly were. It wasn't easy to admit, but it was true. Ava had gotten used to the feeling of being overlooked. She had learned to manage her emotions, to stay professional, to never let her frustrations show. She had learned to deal with people who didn't believe in her or took her for granted. But as the years went on, those small moments began to add up. They chipped away at her confidence, made her second-guess herself. She wondered how many other people were dealing with the same thing. How many other people, like her, were underestimated simply because of the way they looked, the way they carried themselves, or the way they spoke. How many others had been passed over for promotions or opportunities, not because they weren't qualified, but because someone had made an assumption about them. How many others were just trying to survive in a world that told them they weren't enough? Ava didn't have the answers. But what she did know was that things couldn't stay the same forever. Change was slow, but it was happening, and she would continue to be a part of that change. She wasn't going to let the small-mindedness of a few people stop her from achieving everything she had set out to do. It didn't matter if the security guard at the airport or anyone else thought she didn't belong. Ava knew she had earned her place. As the plane continued its steady journey, the turbulence of her thoughts began to settle. Ava glanced at the time and realized that the flight would be landing soon. She still had a lot to do when she arrived at her destination, calls to make, meetings to attend, but for now, she felt like she had gained something valuable from the quiet. A little peace, a little clarity. The seatbelt sign came on and the flight attendants began their preparations for landing. Ava sat up a little straighter, feeling a sense of anticipation rise within her. The work she did was important, and she was ready to face whatever came next, whether it was a tough meeting, a challenging decision, or another difficult conversation. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. As the plane touched down on the runway, the lights of the city came into view, twinkling below. Ava felt a familiar surge of energy. She had arrived, and it was time to get to work. Her role as CEO was never easy, but it was hers, and no one, not a rude security guard or anyone else, could take that away from her. When the plane finally came to a complete stop, the other passengers began to gather their belongings and prepare to disembark. Ava was one of the last to stand up. As she made her way toward the exit, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass of the plane's door. For a brief moment, she stopped and looked at herself, really looked at herself. The woman who had been through so much, who had proven herself over and over again, who had fought for every inch of success. She didn't need anyone else's approval. She didn't need to be validated by people who didn't see her for who she truly was. Ava had earned her place, and she knew it. It wasn't about showing others who she was. It was about showing herself. And in that moment, she felt proud of the journey she had taken, proud of the woman she had become. With one final glance, she stepped off the plane, ready to take on whatever challenges the day had in store. She was a leader. She was strong. And most importantly, she knew her worth. The meeting room was filled with the low hum of conversation as Ava entered. The team had already gathered, and the room fell into a hushed silence when she walked in. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, expecting her to lead, to guide, to make decisions that would steer the company forward. It was always like this. As CEO, the weight of leadership was something she had grown used to, but it didn't make it any easier. The expectations were always there, quietly pressing in from all sides. She sat down at the head of the table, trying her best to push aside the lingering thoughts from the airport and the tension of the earlier encounter. She couldn't let something so small, though it had felt so significant, ruin her focus now. There were bigger things at stake, bigger issues to resolve, and she needed to be at her best for her team, for the company, for everyone who depended on her. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice steady and calm. "Let's get started." The meeting kicked off with the usual agenda: updates on the latest projects, discussions on upcoming partnerships, and reports on company performance. Ava listened intently, occasionally asking a question or making a comment. Her team had always respected her for her insight and sharp focus. They trusted her ability to steer the ship, even when the waters were rough. But as the meeting progressed, her mind couldn't fully leave the events of the day behind. She could still feel the sting of the security guard's words. The way his tone had made her feel like an outsider, an imposter, and that feeling of being looked down upon, of being treated as less than, was a familiar one. Ava had been navigating that feeling for as long as she could remember. It wasn't just about the security guard. It was the constant pressure of proving herself. She had built a successful company, made smart decisions, expanded the airline into new markets, and created opportunities for countless employees. But somehow, there were still moments when people assumed she didn't belong, or that her position had been given to her as a token, as if she didn't deserve it. "Here's the proposal for the new partnership we've been working on with the international airlines," one of the managers said, snapping her out of her thoughts. He was presenting a slide on the upcoming project. Ava nodded and turned her attention to the details on the screen. She could feel her focus shifting as the discussion moved on to the specifics of the deal. Numbers, projections, and strategies, all the things she excelled at. This was her domain. She could do this in her sleep. This was where her confidence came from, where she didn't second-guess herself. As the conversation continued, Ava allowed herself to lean in, fully engaging with her team. There was no time to let lingering doubts creep in. There was no room for self-doubt in these discussions. She was the leader here, and everyone around the table respected her for it. The more she spoke, the more her confidence returned. The more she dove into the details, the more she realized why she was here, why she was the one making decisions, calling the shots, guiding this company. As the meeting came to a close, Ava couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed over the years. She had started out in a much smaller company, doing everything from customer service to operations. She had worked her way up, earning the trust of the people around her. But the higher she climbed, the more the weight of leadership grew. And with that weight came the reality of being constantly scrutinized, constantly challenged, constantly underestimated by those who didn't see her potential. It was the price she paid for being a woman in a position of power, and a woman of color at that. As she stood up to leave the meeting room, she realized that there was still more work to be done. The fight for respect, for recognition, for equality, it wasn't over, and it wasn't going to be easy. But Ava was ready. She had to be. She had come too far to let anyone or anything get in her way now. Her assistant handed her a report as she exited the room, and Ava took it, skimming through the pages quickly as she walked down the hall. It wasn't just about the company's success. It was about her own success and how she would be remembered. She knew that if she wanted to create a lasting legacy, if she wanted to change things for the better, she had to keep moving forward, no matter how many small moments of bias or prejudice tried to knock her down. As she made her way to her office, Ava's mind wandered again to the airport, to the security guard. It was tempting to let that moment define her day, but she knew better. It wasn't worth it. She had more important things to focus on. Big projects, big decisions, and bigger goals. But she couldn't help but feel that nagging feeling, that reminder that even as CEO, she wasn't immune to the biases of others. She opened the door to her office, letting herself into the sanctuary where she could think more clearly. The walls were lined with photos from her travels, awards, and team recognitions. Every picture was a symbol of the journey she had taken, of the obstacles she had overcome. She sat at her desk and looked at the framed photo of her and her team from the company's anniversary celebration. It was a reminder of how far they had come together, how much they had achieved. She glanced out the window, the skyline of the city stretching out before her. Ava had worked hard to get to this point. She had overcome every challenge, every obstacle that had been thrown her way. And though she knew that there would be more challenges ahead, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't going to let anything stop her from continuing the work she had started, from continuing to push for a better future. As the afternoon passed, Ava moved through her day with renewed energy. She reviewed reports, signed off on new deals, and spoke with her leadership team. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. She had found a new sense of resolve. She had always known that her role as CEO was about more than just numbers or operations. It was about leadership, leading with vision, with strength, and with the kind of determination that couldn't be shaken by a single incident, no matter how hurtful. Later that evening, as Ava sat down to dinner, her phone buzzed. It was a message from one of her colleagues, a simple text. "The team just wanted to let you know how much they appreciate your leadership. We wouldn't be where we are without you." A smile tugged at Ava's lips. She had built something incredible. Not just the company, but a team that believed in her. A team that had followed her through thick and thin, believing in the vision she had set. And that, she realized, was what mattered most. Ava put her phone down and took a deep breath. She had made it. She had earned her place at the table, and nothing, not a rude security guard, not the assumptions of others, could take that away from her. The road ahead would still be challenging, but she was ready for it. She was stronger now, more confident in who she was and what she had accomplished. And more than anything, she knew that her journey was far from over. It was just beginning.